Campbell. I'm Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, founder of Afro-Caribbean Spiritual Teaching Center and Children of Kush publication. These two organizations are dedicated to creating a paradigm shift in Black thought. One of the main objectives of these two organizations is to challenge people of African ancestry to think outside the box of Eurocentric thought. We seek to achieve our objectives through the publication of articles which are circulated in the African Diaspora, through videos like this one, which are posted on social media, and through books which are published by Children of Kush publications. Children of Kush publication is currently expanding and promoting a series of books entitled Secrets Your Church Won't Tell You. The 6 books so far in this series are available from the Amazon Kindle store, both as hard copies and as ebooks. To see the full listing of our books on Amazon, just go to amazon.com/author/Leonard Phillips. Let me repeat that. Amazon.com/author/Leonard Phillips, and that's all in lowercase. You can also type in Leonard Phillips, or you can type in Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, or you can simply type in the title of any book you are interested in reading. If you're interested in watching more videos which I produce, just type in Leonard Phillips on YouTube and you should be able to find my videos. There are a number of Leonard Phillips, so just look for the Leonard Phillips who looks like me. As always, I like to begin with an issue of interest to people of African ancestry. Sometimes I focus on something that is happening in Africa or sometimes in North America. I'm also trying to see what we can find out about what is happening in Brazil, because that's African population, a very large African population, and like Black people everywhere, the people in Brazil are experiencing some of the same horrors that people in the African diaspora are subject to. Today, I want to focus a little on Barbados. That's the place where I was born and most familiar with Barbados, so I should be able to speak most intelligently to the issues which are happening in Barbados. Now, I'm writing this script on January 20, 2022, the day after a historic election in Barbados. Now, the general election in Barbados is historic for 2 reasons. Number one, it is the first general election after Barbados elected to become a republic. And number two, it is historic because it is an election in which the improbable happened. On May 24, 2018, Barbadians woke up to the news that the Barbados Labour Party, led by Ms. Mia Amor Motley, had been given a unanimous mandate to govern Barbados. The BLP won all 30 of the available parliamentary seats in that election. As shocking as the results were, most Barbadians felt that this result was an aberration, an anomaly. It was the lightning that strikes once and never again in a million years. However, on the morning of January 20, 2022, that 1 in a million year lightning strike lit up the morning skies for a second time as Ms. Motley received a second unanimous mandate to govern Barbados. Barbadians, for a second time in just under 4 years, gave Ms. Motley all 30 seats in the House of Assembly. Now, this kind of political success is unparalleled in Barbadian political history. I did some checking to find out if something of a similar nature had happened in any of the other Caribbean countries, and I did discover that Mr. Keith Mitchell in Grenada had 3 clean sweeps. I'm not certain that they were all back to back. As a matter of fact, one of my politically minded friends informed me that they were not back to back clean sweeps. I'm just quoting him in case I'm wrong on that point. You would know to blame him and not me. But as it stands right now, Mr. Keith Mitchell holds the record for the number of clean sweeps in the Caribbean, with Ms. Motley coming in a clear second. But since I'm not discussing the Caribbean and focusing on Barbados, I would like to insist that this was unprecedented in Barbadian political history, because if you know anything about Barbados, you would know that we have 2 very well-established political parties, the Barbados Labour Party and the Democratic Labour Party. And the government is alternatively formed by one or the 2 of these political parties. Sometimes the people give the nod to the Barbados Labour Party, and then when they're not satisfied with what the Barbados Labour Party is doing for the masses, they switch to the DLP, and that continues back and forth. Now, political pundits may have recognized that in the last election, and you would recall that in one of my previous broadcasts, I said that it seemed as though the Democratic Labour Party were very slow out the blocks in this particular election. Maybe that had to do with the fact that it was a snap call and it may have caught them napping somewhat. However, the reality is that most of us armchair political pundits and social scientists and political scientists, we were probably anticipating that the DLP would have been able to make some ground since the last election, to the point where they would have been able to win a number of seats. As a matter of fact, most people were thinking that in this election, they could have won at least about 3 seats. Persons like me would have been at least hoping for a few more, but that was not to be. For example, I was hoping that the seat in St. Lucie would have been won by the president of the Democratic Labour Party, but that was not to be. Subsequently, after the failure at the polls, the president of the Democratic Labour Party actually resigned from her position, and certain Barbadists would like to wish Miss De Pisa the very best in whatever she chooses to do, whether politically or otherwise. Now, early on the morning after the election, and I'm now getting to the reason why I am going through all of this. You see, I'm not here really to talk about politics. There's a point I want to make, and I'm just using the political situation as the backdrop to the point that I am trying to make. Early in the morning after the election, I received a message from a WhatsApp contact saying, "Everyone is saying witchcraft again." Let me repeat that. The message said, "Everyone is saying witchcraft again." To clarify the meaning of the message, I made my own inquiry. I said, so you think she's using Obey? The sender of the message reported that this was what was relayed to them. Another person I had a conversation with had used very similar language and even referenced a ceremony Miss Motley had participated in when she was the guest of Nana Akufo-Addo, the president of Ghana. When she was there, there was a ceremony performed in which soil from Barbados was actually buried in Ghana. And many people who saw that became very spooked, and they started saying it looks as though something strange, something mysterious is happening. Now, the attitude displayed in response to the participation of the Prime Minister in the ceremony in Ghana reflects an ongoing suspicion and aversion to the spiritual traditions of our African ancestors. Without even taking time to understand the meaning of the ceremony, many persons have simply retreated to the anti-Black conditioning that was imposed on our enslaved African ancestors and passed down to us from generation to generation. Those responsible for enslaving our African ancestors engaged in a conditioning process that was designed to make them hate their own Africanness. They were made to embrace the big lie that our African ancestral religion was satanic, it was devilish, and it was demonic. Like sufferers from Stockholm Syndrome, our African ancestors were forced to hate, to fear, and to shun anything that had to do with Africa. They were also forced to love, embrace, and promote the religions, the languages, the customs, the dress, the politics, the education of their oppressors. In other words, Africans were taught to hate anything that had to do with Africa and to love everything that had to do with Europe and Europeans, their oppressors. Now, I jokingly told my WhatsApp contact that if Obey could help the Prime Minister achieve such unparalleled success in Barbados, then sign me up for all the Obey and Voodoo available. One last thought before I go into the break. Our Black family in Haiti use their ancestral African religion to motivate them as they embarked on their revolution, which eventually resulted in the liberation of enslaved Africans in Haiti so that they could set up the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Those of us who are familiar with the history of the Haitian Revolution would recall that it was an African traditional practitioner by the name of Boukman. I think Boukman had come over from Jamaica to Haiti. And Boukman was responsible for that famous voodoo ritual that basically undergirded the strength and motivated the Haitian people, got them ready for the revolution. Going from that early stages of the revolution, the Haitian people, notwithstanding the fact that we always say that Haitians are practitioners of voodoo, notwithstanding that fact, the Haitians were able to go on to beat the French, they beat the British, and they beat the Spanish. They did all of that under the influence of what we call voodoo and Obeah. Compare and contrast that to what has been happening to Black people in the rest of the diaspora. Take, for example, what has happened or what continues to happen in America. In the 1960s, we know there was the civil rights marches under Dr. Martin Luther King, where Black people were singing, "We shall overcome, we shall overcome." But as Carol Anderson wrote in her book, Whitewash, or Whitelash, Backlash, I think the title is Backlash. She said that every time Black people make 2 steps forward, there is a white backlash against the advancement of Black people in North America. And perhaps, let me take my time, perhaps one of the striking illustrations of this point came very recently as President Biden attempted to get the voting rights bill passed in the Senate in North America. Now, most Democratic senators were in agreement that the voting rights bill was needed. And it was needed because of what was happening in the aftermath of the Trump loss. We've seen that a number of states in the US have been engaging in some massive voter restriction laws. These kind of laws are being passed to restrict the ability of Blacks and other minorities to vote in the US elections. And so the voting rights bill was deemed as a very essential bit of legislation to be passed in North America. Now, notwithstanding the fact that the Democrats were supportive of the passage of the voting rights bill, we had there was the need for the repeal of something called the filibuster. And the filibuster is just a rule that is used in the Senate to prevent the passage of certain bills by people from the other side. Now, then the vote came to discard the filibuster. Two Democratic senators, Kirsten Sinema and John Manchin, decided that they would vote against discarding the filibuster rule. And so that basically has killed the legislation that Mr. Biden was trying to get passed to protect the voting rights of Black people in North America. So as I said, one step forward, two steps backward. Now, if the Haitians, using their voodoo and obey, were able to win their freedom, beat the French, beat the English, beat the Spanish, establish the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere under the influence of their African ancestral religion. If, as is being suggested, that politicians can use the voodoo and the obey, the African traditional religion of our African ancestors, and achieve unparalleled, unprecedented success in their political affairs, then I would like to suggest to you that the African ancestral religion of our ancestors is in fact some very powerful stuff. Let's take a break. When I come back, I will explore the question, does the Bible and the religions inspired by the Bible outline a path to Black liberation? See you shortly. Welcome back. Now, from time to time, as we go through this series, it will become necessary for me to make some corrections because sometimes in the heat of the moment, especially when you're speaking, when you look away from your script and you begin to speak from your heart, you may have a tendency to say some things which may not be 100% accurate. And since I am striving for accuracy in these presentations, from time to time, as I become aware of some of the slips that have been made, the foul leaps and blunders, as I like to call them, I will take some time to make some corrections. Like, for example, in the last presentation, then I was talking about the sun standing still. I made mention of a group of people who were the subjects of genocides, the genocidal wars by Joshua. And I think I mentioned both the Amorites and the Amalekites in the same story. In truth and in fact, it was the Amorites, not the Amalekites. So that's one correction. And then perhaps one of the most jarring corrections or mistakes from the last presentation, and I really should give myself a slap across the head for this one because I had done the research and I had the information right in front of me, but I was talking about the rotation of the Earth. I had the information there that the Earth rotates on its axis at 1,000 miles an hour. But we did say the last time that the rotation of the Earth on its axis was 100 miles an hour, which of course is totally incorrect. The correct speed is about 1,000 miles per hour. Okay, now that we've done those two corrections, let us get into our subject for today. Now, as I said before the break, I was going to be looking at the biblical stories that deal with liberation. We want to know if the Bible really supports the liberation of African peoples whether the religions that come from the Bible, namely the Abrahamic faiths, if they outline a path to Black liberation. So that's the overarching topic that I'm going to be discussing, but I'm going to break it down into small segments because, of course, we don't want to make these presentations so long. So we're going to break it down maybe into 3 sections. We're going to look perhaps first at the Exodus motif. What does the Exodus motif say about the whole struggle for liberation? Then, as I promised from the very inception, we want to do a special session dealing specifically with slavery in the Bible. Then we're also going to talk about the anti-Black element that can be found in the Abrahamic faiths. And then, of course, we're going to try to draw some conclusions. So that's where we are heading in this series of lectures. Now, the story of the exodus of the Jews from their reported bondage in Africa is perhaps one of the best known stories. The Exodus is the theme of Cecil B. DeMille's classic film, The 10 Commandments. The Exodus was also the theme of the Disney classic Prince of Egypt. Now, personally, I prefer the cartoon version. And in my opinion, the cartoon version was a lot more accurate. The characters seem to be a little darker in pigmentation. And of course, that would be more historically correct. As we made a mention of this, but I like to make mention of it as often as possible, that Egypt is in Africa. And Egypt, especially in its early history, was peopled by African peoples. With time, you had invasion of people from the Middle East. You had people coming in from Asia, and at a later stage, you had people coming in from Europe. But you must always remember that ancient Egypt was an African nation with African peoples. And if you look at the monuments in ancient Africa, those are monolithic reminders to mankind of who those ancient African people or Egyptian people were. There is a calumny of the highest order to suggest that Egyptians in the 13th century BCE look like Charles Heston and Baker and John Derrick. That was the cast of Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments. The Zipporah, the wife of Brother Moses, is described in the Bible as a dark-skinned woman, or an Ethiopian, as she's called in the King James Version of the Bible. And so casting a Caucasian woman, Yvonne DiCarlo, as Zipporah is just downright wrong. Especially since the Bible itself makes it very clear that Zipporah was not liked by the brother and sister of Moses because she was an Ethiopian. Now, then in the ancient world, someone spoke about an Ethiopian. They were talking about a person who had the black thing going on. Ethiopian was synonymous with being black. Now, according to the Bible, Moses grew up in the courts of Pharaoh. So he was accustomed to interacting with dark-skinned peoples. So much so that when it was time for Brother Moses to get married, he chose an Ethiopian woman as his bride. Now let's get back to the story of the Exodus. As I said, it's one of the most well-known stories in most of religion. And it is a story that resonates well with oppressed people all over the world. Now, the Egyptians were some very good chroniclers of their own history. Now, in the Chronicles of Egypt, there is the record of a Semitic group who ruled Egypt during the 15th dynasty. This Semitic group was known as the Hyksos. The Hyksos were eventually defeated and driven out of Egypt as the indigenous Egyptians then took back over their country. As I said, the Egyptians were good chroniclers of their own history, and to date, there is nothing in the chronicles of the Egyptian which corroborate the story of Jews being slaves in Egypt, of the Jews being liberated from Egypt, the 10 plagues, Egypt being decimated. There's nothing in the chronicles of Egyptian history to corroborate the Exodus story that is found in the Bible. And I remember one friend told me that, well, that should not be surprising because after all, it was not favorable history where the Egyptians were concerned. They were the subjects of divine wrath, according to my friend, and as such, it was unlikely that they would have recorded it. But it's interesting that even among contemporary Jewish scholars, questions are being raised about the authenticity of the Exodus story. For example, Rabbi David Wolpe, speaking about the story of the Exodus, had this to say, and I quote, "The truth is that virtually every modern archaeologist who has investigated the story of the Exodus, with very few exceptions, agree that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened at all." So here is a Jewish rabbi saying that the Bible story of the Exodus may not have been the way in which the events actually unfold. Rabbi Wolfe also stated that to date, there is no conclusive evidence that the Israelites were ever in Egypt as slaves, that they ever wandered in Sinai in the wilderness for 40 years, or that they ever conquered the land of Canaan under Joshua's leadership. So he's saying that those details have not been conclusively established by any archaeological evidence. And so a new origin story for the nation of Israel seems to be emerging. And in that origin story, the nation emerges peacefully in Lebanon. The Lebanese community is thought to have taken on the new identity as Israelites and were joined or led sometime later by a group from Egypt. It is believed that as this group grew in power, prestige, and territory, that there were clashes with the surrounding nations. And these clashes with the surrounding tribes were later embellished and recorded as the wars of conquest under Joshua. So that's the new origin story that is developing for the Israelite nation. In 1999, an Israeli archaeologist, Zev Herzog of Tel Aviv University, reported in a popular magazine that stories of the patriarchs were myths and that neither the Exodus nor Joshua's conquest ever occurred. Herzog also argues that the United Monarchy under David and Solomon was at best a small tribal kingdom. So here is a Jewish academic who is basically questioning the stories of the patriarchs of Israel as mentioned in the Bible. And he is saying that these stories never really happened, that they were all myths. Interestingly enough, this is a position that is also taken by liberal Bible scholars who are now challenging many of the Old Testament stories and in fact trying to prove that these Old Testament stories were stories that the Jews borrowed from many of the nations surrounding them. And as such, these stories should not be held as having literally occurred, but rather that the stories were allegories designed to teach moral truths. Now, conservative Jews and Christians, on the other hand, believe that the stories of the Exodus and indeed the entire Bible is literal and true, and that Joshua did, in fact, engage in his genocidal wars against the Canaanites. Now, since this is the story that was passed on to us, this is the narrative that we are accustomed with, that's what we are going to work with in this presentation. We're going to take it for granted that there was a literal Exodus narrative, that the narrative of the Exodus was in fact correct. Now, this narrative has, as I said, influenced the struggles of oppressed people, especially oppressed people of African ancestry. The civil rights movement, which was led by Dr. Martin Luther King, appealed significantly to the Exodus motif. Not only did Dr. Martin Luther King appeal to the Exodus motif, but many who went before Dr. Martin Luther King, I think in terms of Reverend Nat Turner, he was also very influenced by the story of the liberation of the Jews from their Egyptian bondage. Initially, when our enslaved ancestors were landed in the Caribbean and the Americas, religious instruction was neglected because it was felt that as the slaves became acquainted with stories like the story of the Exodus, that it would have instilled within their hearts a desire for freedom and liberation, and that it could have motivated them to engage in slave rebellions, which, as I just said, it actually did. Now, many attempts were made to prevent our ancestors from learning how to read, and they were not given free access to the Bible. As a matter of fact, to circumvent the possibility of our ancestors learning about the liberation of the Israelites from bondage in Egypt, a special Bible was published called the Slave Bible. Now, the Slave Bible was entitled Parts of the Holy Bible Selected for Use of the Negro Slaves in the British West Indies Islands. Now, many parts of the Old Testament were excluded from this Slave Bible, as well as many parts of the New Testament as well. Now, notwithstanding the laws that were passed to keep our enslaved African ancestors from being able to read and to keep them in perpetual ignorance, many of them eventually did learn how to read and became acquainted with the Bible stories, especially the story of the Exodus. On April 3, 1968, just one day before he was murdered, Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous mountaintop speech. With great pathos and perhaps sensing that his time was running out on this earth, Dr. King said, and I quote, "Like everybody, I would like to live. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." Here, Dr. King was invoking imagery from the Exodus narrative. You see, after liberating the Jewish people from their Egyptian bondage, Brother Moses climbed on top of a mountain. Just as they reached the borders of Canaan, the promised land, Moses went up on Mount Nebo. And according to the story, Moses was able to drink in the panoramic vision of Canaan land from afar off, but he unfortunately never went over. He never set foot in Canaan himself. And so Dr. King's rhetoric resonated in minds that had been conditioned by the details of the Exodus narrative. Dr. King very skillfully incorporated this imagery of the liberation of the Jewish captives from bondage, their subsequent travels, And of course, as he came toward the end of his life, he used the imagery of being up on the mountaintop and seeing the land of Canaan, the promised land of freedom for Black people from afar off. And as he said, even though he intimated that he would not get there with them, he knew that Black people would reach the promised land at last. And so, as I've said, the Exodus motive provides a lot of inspiration to oppressed peoples around the world. The whole notion of liberation from slavery, the notion of the gods fighting on behalf of the oppressed, the whole concept of leaving the land of bondage and heading towards Canaan. All of these prove to be great motivators for people who were engaged in struggles of liberation. This, of course, brings us to two fundamental questions that practitioners of the Abrahamic faiths must answer. Number one, if the God of the Abrahamic faiths was so opposed to Egyptian slavery, why did that same God allow the Jews to enslave the Canaanites after liberating them from slavery? That's one question that needs to be answered. And secondly, we also want to have an answer to the question of why the practitioners of the Abrahamic faiths developed an anti-Black philosophy down through the history. Now, these are two questions which I will explore in the next presentation. Thanks for watching this broadcast. As always, feel free to share this video with your friends, your family, and your contacts, both in the African diaspora and on the continent of Africa. Also, feel free to leave any comments you may have on these videos in the space presented below on YouTube. Asante sana na kwaheri, which means thank you very much and goodbye.